Welcome to Books and Bridges, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Here we practice literary diplomacy by celebrating the profound and chasing the beautiful, wherever we may find them. Exploring the wisdoms of the world together with friends and strangers deepens social trust and heightens the discourse of our culture. We embrace the advice of the poets Rilke and Rumi to live in widening circles and thrive in always widening rings of being. Tonight, we examine the guises of redemption hiding in the ruins of tragedy. When the frailty of civilization challenges the tenacity of the human heart, we shrink from what lurks behind the veneer. But a deeper bond emerges between father and son, between the desperation of faith and the instinct of love. Cormac McCarthy's shattering novel, The Road, carries within its pages hints of hope for all those who endure. And here to lead us through the apocalypse is Stephen Frye. Dr. Frye is professor of English and chair of the English department at California State University, Bakersfield. He earned his PhD in American literature and culture from Purdue University. His writing interests include the 19th century and 20th century American novel, including such authors as Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Mark Twain, and Jack London. He also focuses on Cormac McCarthy and the literature of the American West. Dr. Frye has published 4 book-length studies, including Understanding Cormac McCarthy, which is right here, and Unguessed Kinships, Naturalism and the Geography of Hope. He has also written a novel called Dogwood Crossing. Stephen Frye, thank you for sharing your time with us.
Well, thank you for having me, Nathan.
Well, I will go ahead and just start this out and give a few of my own thoughts and framing remarks, but I'd like you after that to just paint with a broad outline of the novel's setting. Mm-hmm. And then I want to open this discussion tonight with the frame that I chose, that I thought of as I think of The Road. What I think of is a quote. It's a quote that hovers over the entire movement of The Road. And it comes from Albert Camus' essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. He says, quote, "Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy," unquote. And in my opinion, The Road is largely about how we deliberate on that question. But Dr. Frye, go ahead and just give us a broad outline of The Road, and then we can just dive into a conversation, ask questions, and exchange a bit.
Sure. Well, The Road is a relatively brief and searing novel about a father and a son in a post-apocalyptic landscape as they travel the road in order to and try to survive amidst not only the decimation of nature, but groups of roving cannibals, what the father to the son calls bad guys. And they're trying to survive. They're trying to find food. They're trying to make it to the coast where they hope and ultimately want and desire deeply to find some kind of community and some kind of safety. The event that has happened at a particular one particular moment where there's a grand flash of light. We don't know if it is a meteor that is the product of a certain kind of natural evil, or if it is the result of some kind of nuclear holocaust. And he keeps that very ambiguous so that we have the possibility of both, again, the destructive nature of the universe and the destructive nature of human beings right at the forefront of our thoughts. He wants them both to be there, and he doesn't want to exclude one or the other. So that's a basic take on the novel. A man and a boy, his son, who he desperately loves, traveling a post-apocalyptic landscape.
Yeah, thanks. That's very good. You know, there are so many different possible approaches one could take to writing about an apocalyptic catastrophe like that. One could, address practical concerns. One could address, civilizational concerns, global concerns. But McCarthy chose to really home in on this father and son relationship, and really kind of plumb the intricacies of the human heart as it as it interacts with, like, as you say, a decimated nature. Why do you think that in such dire circumstances, the father and the son decide and choose to continue to live, to choose to continue to push forward?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, especially considering the choice that the mother makes, which is suicide. And that relates to your issue or your question about Camus and the myth of Sisyphus. On the one hand, and again, McCarthy is polyvalent. He tries not, I think, to fully answer questions like that, but to allow for possibilities. And one possibility is simply they are animals and they are driven by a survival impulse. So on the one hand, we can look to the biological imperative and say you have a father. Every impulse and fiber of his genetic being is telling him to make sure that the son survives, that is an unconscious thing, that is a natural thing. But it could be argued that it's nothing really more than that. And in that context, the mother's decision to commit suicide because of these larger and deeper concerns might seem to be the more human thing to do. But the way that the boy is configured throughout is as a kind of messianic figure. And the language that the man uses to surround his contemplation of the boy is religious or quasi-religious in nature. He says early in the novel, as many know, he says he knew only that the child was his warrant. He said, if he is not the word of God, God never spoke. So the other answer to that question is that redemption is possible in this landscape. Redemption is possible in this world, and one has an obligation to commit to other human beings and their potential survival, even amidst the worst of circumstances. So both this sort of a rigid biological imperative and also a deeper kind of spiritual drive to commit to the principle of love that may be more than simply a material thing. I say to my students often when we talk about romanticism that when we look at romanticism's challenge to the Enlightenment, we can read a textbook that talks about the biological imperative explaining a parent's love for a child. And that textbook talks precisely in terms of the biological imperative, the idea that the selfish gene drives us to perpetuate the species. But then I ask my students, is that how it feels? Is that how we imagine it? Is that how we experience our love for one another? And the answer is inevitably no. And ultimately, it becomes the poet that is able not to deny the biological imperative, but to complete the narrative and make it a totality. And I think that's what I weigh in the direction of that spiritual dimension in this novel. I think it's both, but I do think that McCarthy wants us to see this sense that there is a deep, broadly construed spiritual drive to protect, particularly for a father to protect his son.
Yeah, that's beautiful, the way you described the way that the poet can complete the scientific understanding.
Right.
In fact, I think you could say that's the work of a novelist, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Poet would be, I mean, I'm speaking, when I talk about poetry, I'm speaking, in terms of the romantic kind of movement in the early 19th century, but McCarthy certainly is a poet by any standard that isn't too utterly strict. There's even rhythms and sort of versification patterns to his prose. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And the way you described the mother's decision was very, I think, telling, because I think that's one of the most searing moments in the book. Because she makes a case for suicide that is very grim, but it's very clear-eyed, very rational, very almost rational as steel, steely-eyed. She
Yeah,
makes that
right.
decision to do that. And in a way, she makes that decision based on wanting, I think she wanted even to include the son in that, but
She did.
she thinks actually it's an expression of love to do that. And I think that the response of the father was basically silence. He knew
Yeah, right.
he could not answer. And it reminds me a little bit of the way that Alyosha Karamazov, to go to Russian learn, he responds. I mean, no, it's not Alyosha. It's Ivan Karamazov talking about the Grand Inquisitor and how
Right.
Christ responds to this shattering defense of, or shattering um case against free will, basically.
Yeah,
And he's berating Christ with this, and Christ's response is silence, and then to give him a kiss on the cheek, and to walk out of the room.
right,
So in a way, that the poetic part of the poetic response to sheer cold reason is a type of silence, I think.
right.
It's deafening in the novel.
Right, and a commitment to action. I think you were spot on with the Brothers Karamazov reference and Dostoevsky reference. I think it's all over this novel, and I think the first kind of textual evidence for that would be the fact that the novel is written more or less parallel with his novel in dramatic form, the play *The Sunset Limited*, which is an unvarnished revisiting of Ivan and Alyosha. And the key thing there is that the hopeful interlocutor in those narratives are silenced, but their actions speak louder than any words can articulate. And that's the thing about, the conclusion of the Brothers Karamazov. Alyosha is there in community with this group of boys as they are more or less redeemed from their previously deplorable actions. And that is how Alyosha speaks. And ultimately, Alyosha is, I don't know about the victor, but certainly a resonating force at the conclusion of that novel after Ivan has died. And I think we've got much of that taking place here. And when you read the Brothers Karamazov, it's like reading the Mother in the Road. You cannot, or White in *The Sunset Limited*. Their words are hard to deny. Tremendously difficult to come up with any kind of rational argument given the nature of the circumstances that they articulate. Ivan says, I will not believe as long as one child suffers. And that one child is revisited in the figure of the boy in the road. And the suffering that she ponders he may undergo, that is being potentially raped and consumed as food. I think you're right to suggest that her desire to stop that by killing the boy is something that is arguably an act of love. Yes.
Yeah. And there is what I call the ubiquitous presence of the pistol
Yeah.
in the book. It
Mhm.
really is everywhere. It's behind, it's always in the background. And in a way, it's the father's way of keeping the mother's option alive.
Yeah. Right.
A little bit. But there's this really touching point in the book where he asks himself, in the narrative, the narrator kind of jumps sometimes to the perspective and the point of view of the father, just kind of almost out of nowhere. And the father says to himself, can you do it when it's time? Will you be able to do it? And I think he's referring to protecting the child by using that pistol
Right.
against something that might even be worse than suicide, which is,
Right. Right.
letting him be ravaged by
Yeah.
the roving cannibals that you talk about.
Yeah. He teaches the boy how to do it should the event be necessary, should he be captured, whatever it might be. But of course, the man ultimately concludes that he couldn't do it. In the end, he would not be able to use that bullet. At least that's what he thinks. Now, if the event presents itself, perhaps, but the man really decides, that it's not a thing that he could ultimately do. And that speaks to something that's going on with the man, with regard to, the big questions in the novel about the nature of the world, about the divine, about order and purpose in the universe. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think Cormac McCarthy is a writer of faith,
Mhm.
not the religious kind, but it's a different kind of faith. It's the faith. It presents itself, I think, as a kind of choice. Do
Mhm.
do do I, as a human being, push forward? Do I, as a human being,
Mhm.
push through what this world, puts in front of me as an obstacle, or do
Yeah,
I, you know, back off? And
you're right.
it seems like that kind of choice is always in his novels.
Right.
What in your mind, what lies behind, or what undergirds his sense of faith in his work? Faith in what?
Right. Well, that is a boy. That's a good question and a hard one to answer, though. I think on the one hand, they're constantly talking about God, right? So they're constantly talking about a traditional concept of the divine in the Christian tradition. And we know that it's in the Christian tradition because it's wrapped around such messianic and sacramental language. At the same time, the man alternates between believing, not believing, uh, relying upon God, or being angry at God. And ultimately, what is God in this novel? And there's no secret. Those who you held up my book. I've been pretty clear about this, that I think that there is no system or orthodoxy that I could place Cormac McCarthy into. And when you say that he's not a religious writer in that sense, you're right. He is heterodox in terms of his perspective on a whole range of philosophical and religious issues. But I do think that he weighs in the direction in this novel toward, or at least he toys with, a kind of Kierkegaardian existential Christianity. That is, that where God exists is in them. God is existentially present in the love that binds them together and causes them to hope against all possibility. So it's this again, existential, real and present form of divinity that is not so much out there, but right here, even amidst all the devastation. So that's, I think, I think that God is being conceptualized. God is being conceptualized McCarthy says it, right? Think about the conclusion of the novel, right? Where where the boy is speaking to the woman, and the woman encourages the boy to pray. Well, previously, the boy has been told by his father to talk to him. Even after he's died, talk to him and he will hear his voice. And the woman says, pray. And the boy has trouble praying, but he speaks to his father and he tells that to the woman. And the woman says that that's okay. The breath of God was his breath yet, though it passed from man to man through all of time. Well, the thing of it is that you might expect an Orthodox Christian, a non sort of existential Christian, to say, well, that's good. I'm glad you talked to your dad, but pray to God too. The
Mhm.
woman doesn't. She says, she acknowledges that by talking to your father, you are talking to God. Right. And again, it's about that existential presence of the divine in the moment and in the relationship between the father and the son. I don't know that that's McCarthy's. I don't think that that's necessarily McCarthy's coherent worldview, but I think it resonates for him, certainly in this novel. I think
Mhm.
he's very heterodox. And when we get to later novels, The Passenger and Stella Maris, I think some of those same themes are being echoed, but not in precisely the same way.
Yeah, thanks. I read those parts in your book, and I was impressed with how you weaved in and out of the different types of faith that one could adopt. And
Mm.
you're right. I think it isn't difficult to pin him down on
Yeah,
what he
yeah,
where he stands on that,
yeah,
and rightly so. Let me just read a passage from the book that I thought was
sure.
really descriptive of just the pain of the father. He says, the narrator says, then he just knelt in the ashes The father raised his face to the paling day. Are you there? He whispered. Will I see you at the last? Have you a neck by which to throttle you?
Mhm.
Have you a heart? Damn you eternally. Have you a soul? Oh God, he whispered. Oh God.
Mhm.
That's striking literature, and it really gets at the grief of the father.
Yeah,
Um,
certainly does.
what do
Well,
you take? Oh, go
sure,
ahead.
but no. I'll weave it in.
So, related to any any person's conception of faith or practice of faith is the existence of evil, or maybe just the existence of pain, one could say.
Mhm. Mhm.
What do you think McCarthy's take in this book is on evil?
Yeah. Well, I think the book is to some extent a guarded theodicy. In other words, it's part of that tradition in theology that is attempting to answer that question. That is the problem of pain, the problem of evil. And I don't know that McCarthy is willing to be too assertive about that, because he talks about the common provenance in pain that seems to always be there. So when we go back to that passage that you read, the father, there's never a moment in the novel where the father is more in a place where he believes in God. He believes in God at that moment, um, pretty much, except that he's just righteously angry at it, right? To the point of almost a kind of hatred, the kind of active hatred that borders on desperation and love, right? It's that real mixture of emotions. There's that sense where he is beseeching God to be the father that he is desperately trying to be. And so the problem of pain, how do we contend with it? We don't know. There is the possibility in elsewhere in McCarthy's work where, we for McCarthy, I would imagine that he's so preoccupied with the natural world and the edges of our understanding of the natural world that I can imagine McCarthy asking or saying, why is it that we look at creation as a thing done? So part of McCarthy's answer is it's not finished yet. And when it is, perhaps it won't involve the kind of suffering and pain that exists. I don't know that that's what McCarthy would say, but that idea, that kind of theodicy echoes in this novel, at least, in the sense that that they hang on this possibility that goodness transcends. And if goodness transcends, there is a sense that the father says it, you've always been lucky. There's this
Mhm.
sense that things are going to work out, right? And that's sort of what happens. And some people don't like that in the novel. Some people who have a different worldview think that that's a kind of a cheap way to conclude it. I do not. I think that he's holding out that possibility in the midst of the most bleak circumstances, but circumstances we all know in the nuclear and post-nuclear age or nuclear age, that we're on the edge of that very world. Um, and um, and he wants to imagine a place where we still might hang on to each other, at least, if not something beyond.
Yeah. Yeah, the father does it at several moments in the book. He describes this thing that he has faith in. On the one hand, it's goodness. On the one hand, on the other hand, it's beauty. On
Mhm.
the other hand, it's luck. Um,
Mhm.
what other he ascribes it to other things as well. But it seems like it's at the very end of the book that he places the highest faith in it. At
Mhm.
the very, there will be spoiler alerts in this
Yeah.
discussion. There already have been, but at the very end when he has to relinquish the boy to the world, to this
Yeah.
cruel, unimaginably cruel world. It seems to me that that's the point when he exhibits the,
Mhm.
the most faith in this luck, that this things will
Right.
be all right. This
Mhm.
trust, faith.
Yeah.
That's very striking to me.
Yeah, it is. And it's kind of inexplicable. I mean, I suppose that we could take a rigidly naturalistic reading of that and say the man is dying, his cognition is shutting down, his body is doing things to his consciousness that lead to perhaps these kinds of conclusions. But we don't know that. We don't even know that about how we die. And everything in the book has made the man's conclusions odd but rational, in the sense that things have worked out for them. Things have worked out for the boy. And there are hints that they know that there are other good guys out there. They've seen the other boy, they've seen the dog that may be traveling with them. So there's good, tangible reasons for them to have hope. Even though it's still a risky place that they're functioning in, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I was reminded of when you said that the father does believe in God, but he rails at him.
Yeah, at least at that moment he does.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of difficult to disbelieve in God while at the same time being mad at him.
Right.
I think C.S. Lewis had a formulation, something along those lines. But
yeah, right.
let me ask you a question that takes us in a bit of a different direction. But what role do you think that ancestors play in what motivates the man to continue? Let me, and along those lines, let me just read a couple of passages. So in my version of the book on page 196, that first person, voice of the father comes back and he says, do you think your fathers are watching? He's talking to himself. Do you think your fathers are watching? Basically saying, do you think your fathers are aware of how you are, whether or not you are, giving it your all? And then that first person wondering kind of trails off. And then it comes back in page 210. He answers himself later on. He says, I think maybe they are watching. They are watching for a thing that even death cannot undo. And if they do not see it, they will turn away from us and they will not come back. What is this thing that even death cannot?
Well, one of the things we have to sort of remember is how much of a character-driven novel this is, just in terms of the man's consciousness. And I always want to mitigate, when you're dealing with an author that in the critical tradition was first characterized as a nihilist, there is a generation of us that want to push back against that reading. And want to start seeing ways in which nihilism is not the worldview that McCarthy is fully articulating. But in pushing back, I don't want to go so far as to not acknowledge that the very nihilism that is at least arguably registered in the Myth of Sisyphus and other works is part of what the man's pondering. Right. So on the one hand, he thinks perhaps they're not watching us, but in the passages that you've articulated, right, they are. And that plays out in the book because he's pondering the question of whether or not his ancestors are watching him. And then at the end of the book, the question is going to become, and we have to try to answer it for ourselves, is the father still watching over the son, even after his death? So this issue of ancestors is of paramount importance. And I think that the thing that the ancestors are looking for is that very spark of the good in a Platonic sense that may exist and is exemplified in the metaphor or even the literal image of the fire, which resonates in McCarthy's work, all the way back to Outer Dark, as an image. So I think that's what he's wrestling with. He's wrestling with the idea that the ancestors are dead and gone, dead in their graves, or they're watching in some way, in some cosmological context, expecting him to live or them to live in accordance with certain kind of ethical principles that are grounded in human commitment and love.
Yeah. And it could even be that he's watching himself through his imagination of his ancestors.
Right.
Something kind of like that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was a very profound part of the book.
Yeah, it was.
And you mentioned fire, and this is a book about darkness, about black, about gray, about ash, incineration. One of the things that really struck me, and I thought this is one of the most beautiful passages in the book, is it deals with this idea of darkness and how to orient yourself in the darkness. Page 15, he says, he's wandering through the darkness in the night, and he's taking these big marching steps. He's looking for something. He's trying to find his way back, and it goes like this: an old chronicle to seek out the upright. And then it skips ahead a bit. He took great marching steps into the nothingness. Upright to what? Something nameless in the night, lode or matrix, to which he and the stars were common satellite, like the great pendulum in its rotunda scribing through the long day movements of the universe, of which you may say it knows nothing, and yet know it must. To me, that's striking, because very similar to the ancestors and very similar to the fire, he's looking for some kind of orientation point, some reference point, some center, but he can't seem to find it.
Right.
How does that relate to the whole question of the enterprise of human faith?
Well, again, there's always the question in McCarthy and elsewhere, to what extent do you want to think of the divine in sort of narrowly anthropomorphic terms? And sometimes McCarthy does that, right? And he's doing that in this idea that the divine is manifest in this human commitment and love. On the other hand, throughout his work, he and this goes all the way back. I can remember all the way back to Child of God, and this is a story. One of his, it's his third novel, and it's a story of a necrophiliac who has turned into a murderer and who is killing women and gathering them into a cave, and sort of creating his own sort of carnivalesque world in this context. So we're dealing with some of the worst kind of human behavior, but we also, the narrator also tells us that Lester Ballard, this character, craves a certain kind of order. And he actually tries to create that order in the catacombs where he's gathered these bodies. So, and he is, in McCarthy's words, a child of God, much like yourself, perhaps. So, McCarthy, I think, is rooted in a kind of philosophical and, at least in some sense, theological tradition, where he's saying, let's not think, I mean, I'm going to butcher it, but somewhere out of Aquinas, he referred to God as something like that reality, that is Aquinas, that reality that gives purpose, harmony, and meaning to the universe through his love. But again, purpose, harmony, and meaning and reality. Do we need to think of the divine in these kind of long-bearded super daddy who throws thunderbolts terms, or do we think of the divine as the principle of order that gives continuity, harmony, beauty to the universe itself, and also to us? Do we have to think of an either or there? Can there be a personal dimension to this idea of divinity? Or do we reduce God to simple natural law by taking the personal out? Or is there a way of blending them or thinking of them in those terms? But there is tremendous debate, complexity, endless questioning that we can explore when we think about the various ways that McCarthy thinks about God, the divine, purpose, harmony, meaning, beauty, all those things. But it's clear to me anyway that all of those things are deeply co-implicated in with each other in throughout his work, and especially it crystallizes in the road and in this idea that of order that was in the quote that you just read.
Yeah, that's beautiful. There definitely is in all of McCarthy's work a certain kind of liminal space
Mhm.
of indeterminateness, in
Mhm.
which
Right.
maybe it's the incompleteness that you talked about, that where we could step in and make fill the gaps. And I
Yeah.
like that. I like that metaphor that I read. It's because it seems to express a lot of what the characters feel. They feel like a pendulum, rotating
Mhm.
in the or rotating in the universe, scribing
Mhm.
something that they a universe they don't quite know, but yet they must know it somehow.
Yeah. Right. Right. There's that it's about, there's all kinds of epistemological questions that throughout this. What does it mean to know? Um, why do we try? And what's the object of any kind of epistemological quest? Is there an epistemological quest? And I think there is, running parallel to their road narrative. Why are we here? Should we stay here? Um, what do we need to know about the world and its origins in order to continue to have faith, at least in living in that context? Yeah.
Yeah. Let me read a passage about the fire that you mentioned.
Mhm.
And this is towards the end. He tells the boy, "You need to keep going. You don't know what might be down the road. We are always lucky. You'll be lucky again. You'll see. Just go. It's all right." Um, and then the boy, and then he says, "You have to carry the fire." The boy says, "I don't know how to." "Yes, you do." "Is it real, the fire?" "Yes, it is." "Where is it?" "I don't know where it is." "Yes, you do. It's inside you.
Mhm.
It was always there. I can see it."
Mhm.
What is the fire that we're supposed to carry?
Well, again, a wonderful question. Let me take us back in McCarthy. You have, and I don't even remember them all, but we can go all the way back to Outer Dark. And you have another deplorable character, right? Culham. And he has impregnated his sister. He has left and abandoned their child. He has abandoned her. And he has been pursued by a group of um, outlaw, preternatural outlaw figures who now have him, and they have the child. And Culla finds himself asking them to please spare the child. And he says that my sister would take that child. Now, his redemption from all that he has done is very incomplete. But there is that moment where at a fire, they're holding this child, and the fire is rendered evocatively. And you see this moment of possibility in this, again, this deplorable character who will encounter a blind man at the ultimate passage in the novel. And he thinks about protection and hopes that someone will help this blind man, who is this kind of prophetic figure who sees in spite of his blindness. Later on, and I'll miss some, but later on in Blood Meridian, there is the epilogue where people are traveling across a plain and they're using poles to strike the ground. And it is explicitly the fire which God has put there. And then later, you have the dream in No Country for Old Men at the end of the novel again, where Ed Tom Bell is dreams of his own father riding a horse into a darkened landscape and passing him with fire in a gourd, and he knows that fire will be there, and his father will be there waiting for him when he arrives. So at a very literal level, we can just say, if you want to read it like a social novel, you can just say, he's just saying, there's light within us, and there's fire within us, and keep it going. But there are these deep, I would say, quasi or even metaphysical dimensions to the way fire is being figured as a way of illumination, as a way of animating the body with a certain kind of energy that is more than the physical. And so for them, the fire is goodness. The fire is light. The fire is decency. The fire is possibility. And throughout McCarthy, the fire has at least suggested a certain kind of oblique divinity.
Mm. The boy seems to know and yet not know quite,
Right.
what to do
Right.
with the fire, what it is.
Yeah.
It's that duality again, knowing, not knowing, and trying
Right.
to go forward with that
Yeah.
decision. And even at the very end, the father of the family that they meet, he's kind of befuddled by the question when the boy asks him, "Are you
Yeah.
carrying
Right.
the fire?" And he's like,
Yeah.
"You're kind of weirded out."
Yeah.
The boy stands at the ground and asks him, "Yeah, are you carrying the fire?" And the man, something passed at that moment in the man where he realized, "Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I know what the
Yeah.
fire is."
Right.
And he
Yeah.
said, "Yeah, we are carrying the fire." And then the son was reassured, and he said, "Okay, I'll go
Yeah.
with you."
And he takes that leap of faith,
Yeah.
and I think that's a really, really well orchestrated moment, because you refer to that tonal and literal transition between the father going, "You're a bit weirded out," in other words, not understanding what he's saying, and with no new information, all of a sudden understanding what he's saying, just by looking at his face, presumably.
Yeah.
He gets it, and knows that whatever the fire is, it's associated with goodness, with the good guys,
Mhm.
with decency, and with possibility, and some level of hope.
Yeah. I'll
Mhm.
ask a couple more questions and I'll open it up to,
Sure.
the viewers for questions themselves. Um, what is the bond between nature and humankind, and how does this book kind of lay bare the dependence that we have on this earth and all of its systems and functions and patterns?
Right. Well, McCarthy in an interview was asked the basic question, what should we take away from the novel? And he says that we should be grateful. And the answer is grateful for what or to what? And he's unclear, but it's pretty clear that we should be grateful for the natural world. And not only the fact that the natural world, and clearly in the novel at the most basic level, they're starving, right? And the natural world sustains them, or would have sustained them in before the apocalypse. And so there's that basic animal dependency that defines our relationship to the natural world. But there's also the sense in which, without that natural world to sustain us, we become potentially perverse and monstrous. It's the nature of that dependency. The bad guys are made into cannibals because the natural world has been, largely disrupted. There's any number of people that will read this text. It's been characterized by some as the most powerful or single best work of environmental literature, and I think it is, because it points to that intimate dependency on the physical aspects of the natural world, but also they are bereft. There's all of these memories that the man has that he tells the boy of, and the boy ultimately turns away from, because they're memories of the beauty of the natural world, the sort of emotional and spiritual sustenance that we gain from just being in the world. And so I would say, uh, a profound codependency is the theme of the novel in that context. Yeah.
Yeah. That's very good. Thanks. I wanted to read a passage if there's time. It's the very end of the book, and it speaks to what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit of a elliptical
Mm-hmm.
statement, but it speaks in a poetic way, kind of behind the words.
Mm-hmm.
The narrator says, "On their backs were," so he's talking about a fish swimming in a pond, and I think the time is taking us back even before
Mm-hmm.
humanity.
Yeah.
He says, "On their backs were vermiculate patterns that were maps of the world in its becoming. In the deep glens where they lived, all things were older than man and hummed of mystery. What is this mystery?
Well, the world in its becoming, the maps and mazes, the mystery is what do we mean? What does he mean by the world in its becoming? Did it become and now exist, or is it still in a state of becoming? What's the source of the world itself, right? And, in many ways, the mystery that he's referring to is a mystery that strikes, I think, at McCarthy, the avatar of science. And that is, he spent decades exploring for everything from mathematics to physics at the edge of our understanding. And in the end, I think that he is a radical skeptic. As much as some scientists, like Richard Krauss, for example, in the last interview he had with him, work very, very hard to claim him. He can't be claimed for a scientific positivism that believes that science is going to uncover these mysteries. Ultimately, we confront, and this is all over the Passenger and Stella Maris, we confront the impenetrable wall, the epistemological limits of human consciousness. And that, I think, is the mystery that he's referring to. And that is the mystery of whether or not and to what extent we can know the answer to any questions we might ask. We should, as McCarthy did, keep asking those questions. But again, he's a radical skeptic in the sense that ultimately he's like his favorite novelist, Herman Melville, and that is he admires the scientific endeavor, but at the same time understands that it has the same limitations that human consciousness imposes upon everything. And ultimately, mystery is that unknowability, the secret to everything, that ultimately we will probably always have to cope with. And yet there is beauty, the vermiculate patterns, the world in its becoming.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Melville, because the image of the fish reminded me of Moby Dick, and how Moby Dick represents in my mind the danger of trying to pursue mystery to the point where you can overtake it and control it, and maybe even kill or conquer it. Seeing behind the pasteboard mask, so to speak.
Right.
And as we know, McCarthy was a very big fan of Melville, to put it mildly.
It was his favorite book, Moby Dick.
Yeah.
And he's doing a lot of different things than Melville did, but at the same time, he's echoing those same fundamental philosophical concerns. And ultimately, the watchword, I think, for both writers would be that very word, mystery, and that is epistemological. What can we know? There is knowledge out there. It's not we don't live in a relativistic universe per se, but it's always a question of what are the limits to our capacity to know and to understand, I think.
I think one of the signs of a great book and a great author is that their works continually inspire new and fresh questioning on the great questions of life. And I think this book passes that test in my mind.
So definitely so.
Well, let's let the viewers ask questions. Just submit it in the Q&A if you have one. Feel free to do so. In the meantime, while they're thinking of questions to ask, I guess one of my last questions was just, reading this book, going through this grim journey of father and son. What is civilization in this book?
Well, it's a lot of things, I think. There's a certain kind of, it almost goes back to the classic, the romanticism versus classicism argument. I'm forgetting who it was that wrote that essay. I should know, but I think McCarthy is certainly saying, as he says, as he implies in Blood Meridian and elsewhere, that society ultimately is necessary. Social order is necessary to mitigate against our darkest impulses that can never be wholly expunged from us. So some sort of collective construction of a civilization becomes absolutely necessary, because we cannot function independently of our own accord without some kind of rule or order or structure or ethic that governs us, because our impulses will take us elsewhere.
Yeah, that's great. One of the attendees asks, hello, I hope this finds you well. My question is for Stephen Frye. In an interview you had with the podcast Novelist Spotlight, the interviewer asks you how Cormac McCarthy developed his craft, and you respond with Cormac McCarthy doing these three things: study literature, work with the literature itself and absorb the literature, and then try it out on his own. Can you let me know, if possible, what you meant by working with the literature? How did Cormac McCarthy work with the literature?
Well, quite literally, he was just an avaricious reader. But I would say not just a reader who absorbs, but a reader who re-envisions. So working with the literature first is read the heck out of it, but also read it with a writer's eye. And I see McCarthy as T.S. Eliot's, and I've said this many times, so some of you who have heard me before are gonna roll your eyes, but he's T.S. Eliot's traditional author. In other words, the idea is, in tradition and the individual talent, in the early 20th century, T.S. Eliot says that the real innovator is the new poet. The traditional author is also the innovative author, in that they have absorbed they have a historical sense, and they've absorbed the tradition into their bones. But it lives for them in an organic way, so that once they have done that reading, and they're reading with a writerly eye, there's a sense in which they are able to organically absorb and re-express some of the great truths and the great questions that are still out there. And I've always seen him as whether he read T.S. Eliot, which he, perhaps likely did, or whether or not it's just naturally who he is. He says books are made out of books. The ugly fact is that books are made out of books. And so we know that he is working with tradition in that way. But we also, if we observe him, see that there's probably no writer like him, stylistically or otherwise. He does stand out as unique. But without his absorption of that tradition, we wouldn't have the writer we have in Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah, that's a good point. Beyond, Faulkner, beyond Melville, maybe even beyond Hemingway, beyond Dostoevsky, what kind of range did McCarthy have in his reading that you know of? Like, what are some of his?
Well, you've mentioned the big ones that we know of, and he certainly read a lot of science and a lot of history. But I'm convinced, although others can confirm or deny this, but I'm convinced that he's deeply rooted in Shakespeare, and probably in the Renaissance. He uses a lot of or occasional references to Renaissance ideas and vocabulary. A lot of his cadences are sometimes even Shakespearean in nature. I think also I'm pretty convinced. At one point in time, he was talking to David Krakauer, and he talked about the idea that it's somewhat lamentable that we don't all read the same books anymore. That we don't have curricula, and this is a big debate. And I'm not taking a stand on it necessarily, but the idea is that there isn't a coherent curriculum that we read and absorb anymore in the late 20th and into the 21st century, particularly in literary studies. So my guess is, from that comment, that he has read everything from the classics to Homer to I'm convinced of it, that those resonances are all there. Homer, Ovid, Virgil, Shakespeare, maybe Chaucer, and all of that. and of course you mentioned Dostoevsky, Faulkner, Hemingway, and Melville as the writers that are most immediate to his sensibility and concern.
Wow, that is broad indeed.
Mm.
So Professor Scott Abbott asks, isn't nothingness, the void, the inexplicable darkness, the evil of the road, exactly the substance that opposes us, and without which we have no form, have no being? Standing against the void is where we create or find meaning for our lives. Void equals mystery. If these themes run through the books, including The Crossing, where he stands at the end, quote, in that explicable darkness, unquote, the absence of absolute meaning is paradoxically the source of meaning. And then he says later on, to seek out the upright in the passage you read is to find or create meaning against the formless void.
Mhm.
Yeah, good questions.
Right, it's a very good question. And what McCarthy means by the void, whether he's envisioning it as perhaps an existentialist or and they're not the same thing, a nihilist might, is meaning purely contingent? Is it something that we make as we acknowledge the utter absurdity and meaninglessness of the universe, as Camus has articulated? Is that contingent meaning that we construct after we have chosen not to commit suicide? Is that all there is? And that is a reading that I think is just part of the dialectics of the novel. I think that's a very, very compelling possibility that the professor articulated. And standing, against that are all the things that I've talked about. What is beyond the void? What is there anything beyond the void? Is the void something that is an illusion that masks a deeper reality? A deeper reality that we can't entirely even comprehend. And these are questions that are not merely philosophical. They're questions that are being asked by theoretical physicists and cosmologists around the world. And it's that place where science and philosophy can and should meet, and maybe even religion.
Oh, very good, deep questions. Thanks, everyone. There is at least one more question, I think. Maybe not. That might have been the last one. If there's any more, you can feel free to submit. And then I have one more question to ask as well. And that is, I'll just go ahead and ask that. Does this book hold a personal meaning for you?
Wow, absolutely. And I've said this a few times too. I actually got a copy, and I don't even know how. I was through the lines. I got a copy of a few of us got the road in not manuscript form, but before it was published, we got a hold of it, and we talked about it actually at a conference after that. And so I read it. My son was almost exact. Well, he was 10 years old.
Wow.
So it was deeply personal for me. My daughter was 13 years old. So, it was something where I could place myself in the consciousness of this man in a way that no other book has ever affected me. Because I was in a place in my life where, I wasn't occupying that kind of world, but we always imagine that kind of world when we're raising children. We always know that potential, that apocalypse, that void is out there, and we feel like that we're the only thing standing in the way. I think all parents feel that way. So it hit me at that level, definitely.
Well, that's beautiful. Let me just read to you this passage that really touched me, and I can really relate to what you're saying. Having sons, having had sons who are that age as well.
Mhm.
When I read this, he says this, and it really struck me on a personal level. There were times when he sat watching the boy sleep that he would begin to sob uncontrollably, but it wasn't about death. He wasn't sure what it was about, but he thought it was about beauty or about goodness. And I think somehow that encapsulates that duality
Right,
of the human experience,
right,
and
right.
that close connection, adjacency between beauty and pain. And he says earlier in the book about the provenance of pain is the provenance of beauty is often pain, something kind of like that
Mhm,
as well.
mhm.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that personal experience.
Sure,
There's
sure,
one more question from
sure.
Andrea Balzano. She asked, do you think McCarthy uses biblical imagery because he has read the Bible just like he's read all the rest, science and literature, and is not necessarily privileging Christianity? The Bible has such cultural weight in the West.
Wow. Well, Nathan, when you asked me the question a little earlier about what he read, I neglected to say the Bible.
Mhm.
And there's zero question that he's grounded in the Bible as a text. And I don't think it is. I think McCarthy was Catholic. He's certainly very aware of that religious tradition. He certainly thinks and places God within the context of that tradition at times. But at the same time, I don't think that he wants to particularly privilege Christianity per se by any means. Again, he's very heterodox. And I think the passage that you read a moment ago is really telling, because there is beauty, profound and powerful beauty in that ancient text, the Bible. One can appreciate that beauty and the power of those stories without being religious at all. And I think that no matter where we are on a religious spectrum, if there's certitude in McCarthy, it is in that idea that you articulated in that passage, or that you express in reading that passage, about harmony and about beauty. It comes at a terrible cost. McCarthy himself said that in All the Pretty Horses when he talks about the vision of the single flower, that the blood of multitudes might be exacted for the vision of the single flower. It's a beauty that is costly, but it nevertheless is the outcome of the universe. And that, I think, is the fundamental thing that McCarthy clearly has faith in.
Wow, let's close on that. Let's bring this conversation to an end. That's very beautiful sentiments, and this has been a soul expanding discussion for me at least, and I hope for you, and I hope for everyone else listening.
Absolutely.
Um, I have to say, having read your book and having listened to you and listened to some of your other interviews, you are a well-spoken and well-written scholar.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your writing, even though it's scholarly and it's literary criticism, it's good writing, it's beautiful writing, and I think the tone of it is consistent with with McCarthy's tone. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming, and hopefully we can keep in touch.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.